Welcome to Oh God, What Now, the inflatable podcast that started its journey long before this shipping lane got busy. I'm Alex Andreu. On today's show, on the day of two catastrophic by-election losses, it was also confirmed that we ended last year in recession. What does this mean for Sunak's 5 pledges and his electoral prospects? Plus, Britain is doomed, we are told daily by a familiar list of right-wing commentators. Why are so many Brexiteers now addicted to talking Britain down? And we choose our heroes and villains of the last few days. Let's meet the panel. First up is the Associate Political Editor of the New Statesman, Rachel Cunliffe.
Hello.
Hi, Rachel. Rachel, Kemi Badenoch, your favourite, she's got into a massive public spat with former Post Office chairman Henry Staunton. What's happened?
Well, firstly, she's not just my favourite. She is the favourite to be the next Conservative leader, possibly sooner rather than later. We'll see. Although not great for her at the moment, she's at war with the Post Office, or rather the Post Office scandal that we have ITV to thank for basically being the major talking point of politics in January. So the former chair of the Post Office accused her and the government essentially of stalling compensation for the victims of the Horizon software scandal, and also suggested that he had been dismissed because, and this is a quote, that he alleges that she said they needed someone to take the rap for the scandal, which is pretty major. She hit out on Twitter over the weekend in very, very strong terms, calling these allegations lies, which is actually like quite strong language for a politician to use about an official, about anyone really. And she's giving a statement in the House of Commons as we record this podcast. She's backtracked on the lies language slightly. She said there's no evidence for these claims and that they've been misrepresented. But she's still essentially accusing him of having made it all up because he was bitter over being sacked. He, meanwhile, has come out and said that he's got a paper trail for all of this. So this is going to be incredibly interesting to follow.
Very, very interesting. And just because I think most people's instinct would be the sort of let them fight Godzilla gif, we should say that Henry Staunton was only appointed as Post Office chair last year. So he really has very little to do with this, which might seem to lend a bit of credibility to his allegation that it was they just needed a scapegoat, basically. So they found someone at the top. Could this impact Badenoch's leadership ambitions, do you think? Is that why she's had such an extreme reaction? Because she senses the stakes, the danger is really quite significant.
There might be some of that. Obviously, Ed Davey was a Post Office minister at one point during the many, many years while the Horizon scandal was playing out, and has really taken a lot of heat for it. I mean, there have been lots of ministers.
He was Post Office minister for a year and a half.
Yeah.
Well, it was going on.
Well, there were
out
lots.
of 25 years, it's like
there were over a dozen, I think, ministers, Post Office ministers at various points from all parties. But I think the fact that he was the one who was still a prominent figure in frontline politics meant that he got a lot of heat for it. Yeah. So I think Kemi Badenoch will be concerned that as somebody who is herself in frontline politics, a lot of the kind of tarnish of the scandal could come off on her. But I think there's sort of a wider point about her attitude and demeanour. We were talking about this on the podcast a couple of weeks ago about how she doesn't really like talking to journalists, and she's also quite
saying that.
I say aggressive, defensive. Like, her attitude often when she's asked a question she doesn't like is to really go off on one, and you saw her really go off on one over the weekend with those tweets, backpedaling slightly but still being, I would say, quite aggressive in her statement to the Commons. And if there is a leadership campaign, you're going to have lots more examples, opportunities for that side of her to be on display to the public.
Next up, it's political correspondent for The Independent, Zoe Grunewald. Hi, Zoe.
Hello.
Zoe, Labour language on Gaza has also moved a little again this week, saying that Israel may have gone beyond self-defense, calling for a lasting ceasefire right now. That seems to me stronger than it was. There is an SNP motion on Wednesday designed to put Labour on the spot. Might they be manoeuvring to actually support it? Because they've refused to say when asked whether they would or not.
Yeah, so Wes Streeting was on the morning media round very much sticking to the line, which is that they need to see the SNP motion before they make a decision. He says they're considering their options. I think what's really significant about this is it's not only the second time that this sort of amendment has come in front of the Labour Party. We know last time it caused a huge split. Almost 1/3 of Labour MPs backed the rebel amendment. I think it was 10 maybe shadow ministers also backed down and resigned their post in order to support it. You know, Starmer came under a lot of pressure. We also know that the public is upping the ante as well. So I think a YouGov poll last week said about 2/3 of the public now support a ceasefire immediately. 80% of Labour voters also support a ceasefire. So we can see that Starmer is strengthening his language. Now, previously, he's obviously come into quite a lot of pressure and scrutiny for his comments about Israel. Obviously, very early on, he had that interview with LBC where he seemed to be basically saying,
he fucked up.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's just be frank.
And now that Labour are really feeling the pressure from this, so you can see that there is a softening, as you say, of the approach. What else is significant about this amendment is it comes the week before the Rochdale by-election. We know that this has been disastrous in Rochdale. So people are talking about there's a real prospect that George Galloway may win there. That is quite worrying for a lot of people, a lot of communities. I was speaking to a community leader in Greater Manchester earlier who was talking about his concerns about George Galloway taking that seat. And Labour are just really nervous about the accusations that they let this happen because they weren't strong enough and they didn't, take an approach that was backed by the public, backed by Labour members and backed by their own MPs as well. So whether Labour actually do support this amendment, that's yet to be seen. But you're right, what we are seeing is quite interesting. They are sort of avoiding the question.
Presumably the SNP will then fashion it so that they can't support it by adding a clause that says
and also
Gordon Brown smells of poo.
They're not going to want to look like they're following in behind the SNP. They're going to want to look like they're leading here because they're at, loggerheads with the SNP.
So they might put down their own.
Very, very possibly. But yes, it's all yet to be seen. But I do think what we are seeing is a movement towards something to that effect.
And finally, our guest this week is the only comedian to have performed at both the Labour and Conservative Party conferences. What a whore. Welcome to the podcast, Alistair Barrie.
Thank you, sir. Lovely to be here with such a wonderful and warm introduction.
Alistair, you have recently had gigs that took you into the dreaded Schengen area of this place called Europe. Never heard of it. How did you find the experience?
Well, I mean, someone must have had a look at my Instagram because once again, I showed a picture of one queue that was EU passports with no one in it, and then one that was full that I was in. And this has happened about 5 or 6 times since I've gone over to that foreign place you've just mentioned. And every time I've sort of put a picture of it out, there's been each time fewer and fewer angry people going, "This has not happened, you are making it up."
Yes.
Whereas now there was just literally one response going, "I have travelled quite extensively since Brexit and haven't really noticed a change." I've done about 5. The absolute winner was going to France. Charles de Gaulle, we were in a queue, myself and another comedian, in a queue for 2 hours and 10 minutes. It was 2 wonderful things. One was that another comedian behind us with an EU passport took the flight after us and came and landed an hour and a half after us and met us at the other side of passport control. And the other one has happened a couple of times. I don't know if you've seen it. The French, I mean, I know there's this narrative that they're doing it just to bait us, but there was twice just a delightful French lady, just a sort of bog standard Air France uniform, but somehow made it look like Coco Chanel in haute couture, just walking up and down the queue, just going, "A European passport?" No. And just kept on doing it until eventually she saw my face and just came over to me and went, "European passport?" And I growled at her and she just went, "Not anymore." So yes, there's been some interesting travels to Schengen, and frankly, my experience is that it is harder to get into countries now that we've taken back control.
Presumably, your set still includes the odd reference to Brexit. How do audiences react?
Well, it depends. I mean, I did say about the queue that I was in, I'm sure that more than 48% of us were pissed off, although obviously 52% of us knew that that's what they'd voted for. To be honest, the gig I've just done, actually, I've just come back from Norway where I was doing forces gigs, and they're not the least Brexity or the most Brexity people you'll ever see. But actually, when you do gigs with more EU nationals, I think it's safe to say, I mean, my take is what the hell have we done to ourselves? And it seems fair to say that their take is, what the hell have you done to yourselves? So, yes, it's interesting, and I definitely am including some Brexit material.
Now, last week started as Keir Starmer's most difficult one for some months. By Friday, he was high-fiving the team and celebrating another 2 historic by-election wins in safe Tory seats. People went to the polls on the same day it was confirmed that the country's economy actually contracted in the second half of last year. The political weather can certainly change very quickly nowadays, but as environmentalists have been pointing out for decades, the weather is not the climate. Despite sunny blips, the political climate is getting steadily worse for Sunak. Back when the PM articulated his 5 promises, he said he expected people to judge him on the results. I quote, "We will either have achieved them or not. No tricks, no ambiguity. We're either delivering for you or we're not." But by what margin is he missing those pledges? Is there still time to turn it around? And what will failure mean for his electoral fortunes? Rachel, let's talk about those by-elections first. How bad were these defeats for Sunak and his party?
Oh, they're pretty bad. They're pretty bad. Okay, so I went up to Wellingborough a couple of weeks before the by-election to meet the candidates, spent some time with the Labour candidate, tried to spend some time with the Conservative candidate. They did not want to meet.
Is that Peter Bone's girlfriend?
Peter Bone's girlfriend, Ellen Harrison. I went to Peter Bone's old office, which was being used as the campaign HQ. Knocked on the door, nobody there, looked utterly dilapidated, lights out, no sign of sort of posters. I mean, posters outside on the windows, but inside, stacks of leaflets or signs, absolutely none of that. I didn't see I didn't clock that the car parked outside was a sort of rundown old banger that had been parked there forever. But various other journalists did sort of spot that. And that is a seat that had an 18,500 majority. It was a seat that Labour told me had not been on their target list, wouldn't have been on their target list if it hadn't been for a by-election. And oh, look, they've got a Labour MP now. Kingswood is a bit different because that was always going to be more of a marginal. But that, I think, is bad for the Tories in a slightly different way. I went and interviewed Chris Skidmore, who was the Conservative MP who stood down and triggered that by-election. Chris Skidmore, he referred to himself as the Pete Best of the Britannia Unchained Beatles, because obviously he is the author of that book, Britannia Unchained.
Yeah. He's never got into...
Yeah, it's Liz Truss, Kwasi Kwarteng, Dominic Raab and Priti Patel and Chris Skidmore. Everyone forgets that he was involved in it. But basically he said that he wanted to trigger a by-election because he wanted Kingswood to be the opposite of Uxbridge and South Ruislip, where the Conservatives clung on to Boris Johnson's former seat by 470-something votes. And they took from this that the way to win an election is to U-turn on net zero climate policies and push back really hard against anything like ULEZ or funding for green energy or anything like that. That would win them the election. And Chris Skidmore was the minister who signed net zero into law, and he wanted to give them a by-election defeat that showed them the opposite lesson, which is kind of interesting that you've got, some of the fiercest criticism of your government coming from within your own party. All of this very roundabout way of saying, yes, bad for the Conservatives.
The idea of calling yourself Pete Best to the Britannia Unchained, kind of that metaphor does rather overlook the fact that the Beatles were quite good, doesn't it?
That's true.
As opposed to Britannia Unchained, who produced some of the most disastrous policies and one of the all-time winning disastrous prime minister of all time.
But they did produce a prime minister though, which is more
better than the Beatles.
Very much a one-hit wonder.
Now Sunak gave a poll clip on Friday on this, which seemed to imply that this was just midterm blues. I mean. Yeah, that there is no enthusiasm for Labour, and apparently the message he takes is that he must stick to his plan. Is any of this true or relevant, or is it? What's happening?
I mean, on the one hand, what do you expect him to say? Do you really expect him to say, "Yep, we're fucked. Like that's unlikely. I mean, I think a lot of people would respect him more if
He'd
he
win
said
some people
that.
over with that, wouldn't he?
It is true that governments fare badly in by-elections. It is true that turnout for both of these is very low, which is always the case in by-elections. It is true that it seems to be less of people enthusiastically voting Labour, although there were people who voted for Labour who had voted Conservative. There were Tory Labour switches. But the biggest story is the complete and total collapse of the Conservative vote. That is true. That is a point that you can make. That is not necessarily a point that I think should comfort the Conservatives to say, no, the people who voted for you 4 years ago really hate you now and won't come out and vote. Like, I'm not quite sure how that's meant to be a positive message.
I also don't get how that is a response to say they didn't, we didn't lose because they liked the others.
They
we
just
lost
really
because
hate
they
us.
really hate us.
Yeah.
Zoe, Jacob Rees-Mogg, another favourite, he hailed Kingswood as a victory for the Conservative family, I quote. Is the assumption that all reform votes would revert to Tory a safe one? I think you did some work on that.
Yeah, so, I mean, first of all, give Jacob Rees-Mogg the new chairman of the Conservative Party role, because that is some spin, isn't it? That is some really, really impressive spin.
Can I tell you, before you tell us, the funniest bit of that is that he was asked, because half of that constituency is actually going into his constituency after the boundary changes. So the Sky journalist that was interviewing him said, "So are you here to keep an eye on what's going on?" And he went, "Oh, no, I'm here as because I'm a correspondent for GB News." I just thought, what are you doing?
He never says it like that, though, does he? He always says GB News, on which I have a show. He's never a correspondent, is he? As if we didn't know at this stage.
But it's like, no, I'm here as an impartial observer of my own actual constituency.
Much like Nigel Farage turning up to the popular Conservative movement
as an observer.
Of GB
Sorry,
News.
so tell us about the polling.
Well, so it is true that Reform voters look like Conservative voters in many ways. They are similar demographics. Just as Professor John Curtis said last week, for every one person that's turning away from the Conservative Party and going to Labour, there's one turning away from the Conservative Party and going to Reform. So there is something to be said in the fact that the Conservatives are losing voters to the Reform Party.
So the outflow is going quite largely to Reform.
And it is a pretty safe assumption to make that the majority of Reform voters do look like Conservative voters and may at one point have voted Conservative. But the problem with this is it assumes that these people could be tempted back to the Conservatives, and they're not, just doing a protest vote, which is often what Reform is. There are lots of people who are very angry with the Conservatives, and it goes back to that point you were saying earlier, this defence that Sunak and the Tory party chairman are putting out, which is, there just isn't much enthusiasm for us. Well, that's not great. Why isn't there? Why aren't you doing something about that? And all this kind of battling and all this, warring for the heart of the Conservative Party and changing direction, I don't think they realise that pisses people off even more. Yeah. But I did do a piece of work on this because Richard Tice, who is the leader of the Reform Party, has basically said that they are parking their tanks on Labour's lawn next. So they've got the working class Conservative voters. Now they're going to go for the working class Labour voters. Now, I spoke to several pollsters who said that just simply wasn't the case because working class Labour voters will not vote Reform. And one of the reasons for that is that still about 75% of Labour's voter base support being in the EU. They don't want to leave the EU. And the major thing that determines if someone's going to go to Reform is how they feel about the EU. They don't like it. The other point that was made to me by Lord Hayward, which I thought was very interesting and something we forget, is we talk a lot about the working class and we often think of the white working class, but actually a lot of Labour's working class base is black minority ethnic. And Reform have done nothing but set about alienating those voters. So this idea that Reform now can snatch a load of votes from the Labour Party is just simply not the case. And to some extent, Reform have probably kind of hit their wall, unless something massive was to happen. And one of the things that was flagged to me is net zero could be a bit of a catalyst to move some Labour voters away. If Keir Starmer came in and people were facing much higher bills and felt like the government weren't taking responsibility for green policy, you could imagine a circumstance where people might think about moving away from Labour. But would they think about Reform necessarily? EU is still the big question.
I'm still reeling from the idea that you'd believe John Curtis over Jacob Rees-Mogg when Jacob Rees-Mogg is so clearly a
Listen,
bastion
it was
of
a
truth.
tight competition, but I just
Well,
something about John. I really
Jacob,
trusted.
that wonderful interview he had with the farmer last week, where he was taken apart. Also, a man who believes the new regulations are an act of self-harm, and named all 900 of his children after Renaissance popes. So I'm definitely going to go with Jacob on this one. I think.
I mean, I guess the thing, I feel for them a little bit because all this feels
don't.
very much. No, I do on one level, because this feels very much like what we were doing after the 2 Labour defeats, where we were adding up all the votes that could and should have been ours. And, somehow we were coming up with circumstances in which we could have won. How do these defeats, do you think, add to the doom narrative about the Conservative Party in the media? Because that is quite influential when it comes to the actual MPs.
I think, we didn't see as much dissent as we might have thought we had from Conservative MPs. Obviously, we had this statement from the New Conservative group, which is that kind of pretty right-wing, low taxation, family values group of MPs led by Miriam Cates and Danny Kruger, who said Rishi Sunak needs to change direction. He needs to adopt much more conservative values. And basically everything they listed was kind of what Reform are talking about anyway: lower taxes, roll back on net zero, higher immigration curbs. And obviously, Andrea Jenkins was, always gets a pop in when she can.
Out and about.
Out and about, saying things. But so far, it's remained relatively together. But I think they're all waiting for the locals as well. I think they're thinking... And the budget. I think at the minute, and I'm sure we'll get onto this, but we're seeing a lot of pre-briefing about the budget. I don't know if anyone's noticed.
A lot of conflicting pre-briefing about... Like, he seems to be flying kites in all kinds of directions.
Well, you have to ask who's it for. And talking about, we are going to lower taxes, I mean, that's just sort of saying, please don't kick me out.
Alistair, a total of 58 Tory MPs at the last count have announced they will not be standing for election. They include people like Ben Wallace, Dominic Raab, Matt Hancock, Sajid Javid, Kwasi Kwarteng. I mean, big names. What does this tell us about the mood in the party?
It tells us that 58 MPs is a woeful underestimation of the amount of Conservative MPs who will be looking for a job at some as yet unspecified point in the future, depending on how desperate Rishi Sunak is. And if it is January next year, then I think they are really going to be so desperate. What's interesting about that list, though, that you read out is... Ben Wallace, who's the only one I think we can safely say who, it's not that we should be worried about Conservatives, we should be worried about the workplace they're going into, who will be terrified at the idea of anyone but Ben Wallace. Ben Wallace has got a reasonable CV. He seemed to do a reasonable job as Defence Secretary. And the others, Matt Hancock, if there's a game show available, Dominic Raab, if there's a horror film to be made, and Kwasi Kwarteng, if there's a horror film to be made involving economics. So generally speaking, it's showing, I think, a lot, especially like Red Wall guys who've literally come in and realised that they're going straight back out again. And actually, again, as you were saying, feeling for people. If you've suddenly gone to a job in Westminster making, 85 grand a year, maybe you've upped the mortgage, whatever, it's all a little bit terrifying for them. But I think, as you say, when you started this piece, you said back when Rishi Sunak made his 5 pledges, which I have to pick up on the tense there, because as far as I can remember, he makes them every time he opens his bloody mouth.
Yeah, he
and
does.
It's so genius.
He's kind of eased up on that recently.
Someone must have gone, mate,
shut up. We're going to miss them.
Now
like
he
all
just
of them.
refers to it as the plan.
Yeah, the plan.
Delivering on the people's priorities,
Yeah.
which I just don't
I
see
have
that
to
he
say,
is.
Alistair, I like to cast against type, so I would go for Raab in the quiz show and Hancock in the horror film.
Oh, my God.
I think that would be quite
A
chilling.
new one called The Scariest Link, just with a throbbing vein.
There are reports, incredibly, that a group of Tory MPs are trying to convince Sunak to stand down rather than risk another leadership challenge. Would another change of leadership, you think, annoy voters even more?
I think it's
Or
insanity.
are they maybe now at the let's just get the goalkeeper to go and play as a striker, because what else could
It's
happen?
obviously insanity, but at the same time, they are now trying to work out how to replace the leader in a slightly more friendly, cuddly, inclusive manner, because Rishi has clearly not... there was a tremendous thing I heard Simon MacDonald, the former civil servant who basically outed Boris as knowing about Chris Pincher. Was that his name? Simon McDonald?
Yeah.
Saying the extent to which you have people in office now who have no experience. Sunak only came into Parliament in 2015.
Yeah.
He's proving himself to be woefully inexperienced. I mean, the bad calls, the terrible politics. It's evident for everyone to see. But actually turfing him out as they turfed out Johnson, as they turfed out Truss, even they know it would look ludicrous. So somehow they think sneaking up to him and going, could you just quietly just put your own letter in so we don't have to put ours in, suddenly seems okay. I mean, it's insane, but you can see why they're doing it.
Rachel, many Tory politicians and media proxies are keen to point to this being only a technical recession or paper recession. Do they have a point?
I mean, yes, in a way, but not the point that they think they're making. So I guess the point they're making is if the economy grows by 0.2% or shrinks by 0.2%, the impact it will have on people's day-to-day lives is minimal, and it's the fact that it says minus growth of this level, that's not what people will feel in their household energy bills, in their mortgage payments, their rent payments, in the supermarket shop. So technically we're in recession, but people won't feel it. The problem is people won't feel it because what they're feeling is a cost of living crisis anyway. So you can make the same point almost in reverse and say when the economy grows at 0.2%, which we had
no one seems to say
positive
it's just
news.
paper growth.
But people don't feel it as growth because their material circumstances are getting noticeably worse. And there's a terrifying stat here from the Centre for Policy Studies, one of the right-wing Tufton Street think tanks, but stay with me on this, that the economy would need to be growing by 2.9% every single year over the next 50 years if we want to maintain current welfare spending. Now, you can argue that that is a point about them trying to cut the welfare bill, but fundamentally the reason that we have such a funding shortfall in the NHS, in public services, is that growth for the last 10 years has been basically stagnant. It's been 10 times smaller than it should have been when the projections were made. We're going to be spending this amount of money. This is how much we'll have coming in. And so all the projections are direly off. And that is having an impact on departmental spending budgets across the government. And it's going to be a massive problem for Labour to solve as well. They want to keep the spending. We're not growing at that rate. The economy is basically flatlining and has been for the last decade. So it doesn't matter that it's a technical recession, a paper recession, rather than an actual one. No, what matters is we've got stagnant growth and no real plan from any of the parties as to how you can get it back to that line. That means we can maintain spending.
I guess the reason it matters, I would say, is because Jeremy Hunt, for two budgets now, or one budget and one autumn statement, if you want. I mean, he's actually called them the growth budget and an autumn statement for growth. So he's meant to be throwing everything at this, everything, and it's nudging slightly the wrong way. And to come out of that with a conclusion that our plan is working, it seems to me a little bit to challenge credibility. He came out after those figures and said, look, it was always going to be like this because dealing with inflation depresses economic growth, but dealing with inflation was the priority. I mean, why then promise to do both things at the same time?
Because
this is kind of what I said and every economist said back last year, that you can't. Those two tackling one exacerbates the other. I think what Sunak was trying to do in January a year ago was list 5 priorities, things that seemed impressive, but that at the time that he was saying them looked achievable by the end of the year. In fact, if you looked at the forecasts, inflation was forecast to halve, the economy was forecast to grow. So I think what he was doing was looking, because he's a spreadsheet guy, right? Looking at all the spreadsheets and going, aha, the very clever economists at various organizations think this is likely to happen anyway. If I say it's my plan to make them happen, then I will get the credit for them happening. I think that was the broad idea. The problem is that the economy doesn't always behave in exactly the same way that the forecasters think it will. And having essentially claimed that he could take credit for things that were beyond his control for the most part, now they're going in the wrong direction.
he and his government are going, you can't blame
Someone
us. They were
else's-
beyond our control. And everyone's like,
Yeah.
but you said you were going to fix it.
It's almost as if the forecast that it was going to grow, and you go, was that an actual genuine forecast, or was it just people going, sooner or later it's got to, hasn't it?
It's gotta
And
get
Rishi almost
better
took
at
a
some
gamble.
point.
I think they've almost gone, because they don't want to use the words I can't even do it.
Recession.
Because everyone's gone, that would work, wouldn't it?
Recession.
Conservatives have gone, no, we don't want to call it that. And even Labour have gone, I don't want to pronounce it.
The head of the OBR caused a bit of a fracas last month by describing forecasts beyond 2025 as worse than fiction, because he said that basically the government has given him nothing on departmental spending past March next year. So is the government able to ultimately achieve its growth and debt targets by just pointing to a future that they've made up?
Well, I feel like we're getting, we talked about this earlier, we're getting a lot of briefings and anti-briefings about the budget, which, as I said, really indicates to me that the government is panicking and feels like the walls are closing on all sides because they're trying to keep the Tory right sweet and say, please don't get rid of us right now, we're going to do this. But you've also then got the OBR and the IFS and all these, big economic,
And the Bank of
powers that
England.
be, and the Bank of England saying, well, hang on a second, how are you going to fund that? The latest thing is
And the
obviously...
woke IMF. Let's not forget them.
And the OBR has basically come out and said, in Jeremy Hunt's autumn statement back in November, the projections they made were given on just very limited information. So the government kind of deliberately gave them just headline figures about departmental spending, nothing broken down, which is a great, very convenient way of being like, all you need to know is everything's under control. Now, would you go away and write me a nice
We're going
forecast?
to spend less.
And it's quite convenient because now Jeremy Hunt can come out and say, well, actually, the OBR's, edited everything and changed it and reforecast. I think there's new figures coming out on Wednesday, and that's actually given us less room. And damn the OBR.
Damn
It just feels like more of this kind of briefing against institutions and trying to act like the government is somehow being repressed or squished by the powers that be. And there's so much pressure on the Conservatives now to put in tax cuts, but they know it just isn't possible because, as Rachel was saying, public spending has been so depressed. There's no way that we can keep public services in this country functioning. So Jeremy Hunt is in this kind of rock and a hard place of objective economic reality and what the Tory right that have got their, them in a vice want. And I think basically the people who are going to come out bruised from this are probably the OBR.
The OBR that was set up by George Osborne,
yes,
as a way of tying Labour's hands in a future Labour government.
Yeah.
Exactly.
The problem is it has quite high sort of trust with the public. The OBR is quite trusted as an institution, even though it's quite new. Alistair, let's talk briefly about the other two targets. So let's start with stopping the boats. Stopping the boats. I mean, was that just a stupid thing to promise? I mean,
not in terms of it being a sort of a salient issue that people care about, but I mean the method.
But did anyone
ever?
But then you put Rishi Sunak.
But you put Priti Patel in charge of it, who comes up with stuff that makes you just go, "What planet do you?" I mean, she was some sort of wave machine that we would just, and it would just magically kind of. I mean, it was kind of King Canute, and I use the spelling advisedly. The kind of pushing the waves back by wishing them back. The fact is that because of Brexit, we lost the Dublin arrangement. So therefore, all the problems we have, not all, but a lot of the problems to do with asylum were suddenly we were not able to deal with it. We haven't taken back control. We've in fact given it up. There are much better ways of dealing with the boats involving, maybe speaking to the French, although as I've actually earlier described, it's actually quite difficult to get into France now. So talking to them when you're stuck in 2 hours and 10 minutes at passport control with a French woman there going, European passport, is difficult. But at the same time, if we spoke to the French, if we genuinely tried to tackle the actual gangs rather than the people who are essentially victims, and what have you got? You've got Nigel Farage sort of sailing around the Kent coast in a done-up windcheater going, look, there's more invasions. That's not the way to deal with it. There was a sensible way to at least make inroads into the problem, but that, if you put Priti Patel and Suella Braverman in charge, I know, it's not where you thought I was going to go with this.
What about NHS waiting lists? Sunak admitted in a recent interview that they failed at this, but he's blamed junior doctors for it. I mean,
of course he
that's
has.
fair.
Of course he has.
They're on strike.
Well, they are on
The
strike.
lazy so-and-sos.
I know. They're a great. The problem I have with this, my dad was a surgeon, and he genuinely said to me, doctors striking are not doctors. And the thing is, the Conservative government have weaponized that refusal of the medical profession to even countenance striking. So if you look at actually their real term pay, and how much overtime they do for free. I mean, they probably actually earn less than a barrister at Pret, and frankly, they should probably now go to Pret because there's a lot of opportunities for the lack of EU workers who used to fill those positions. So there is a difficulty with doctors striking, but the idea that the waiting lists is to do with doctors striking is pie in the sky, really. There was a small, I don't know if you remember it, there was some sort of pandemic a little while ago that may have played into it, and I don't remember the strikes happening then. It's a blame game, and it's the only thing the blame game is the only game in town as far as Rishi's concerned.
Rachel, the BBC also reports this week that millions of people are not on the official statistics at all because trusts have been instructed not to include people who need ongoing care. I mean, I am actually part of those statistics because I need 2 operations for something, and I've had one, and the other one has been postponed for months, basically. So I don't even appear in that queue because I've had some treatment. So at that point, I get a big green tick next to me. I mean, is there a political risk to constructing that sort of reality? Debt is coming down, the economy is growing, NHS lists are falling, and I've stopped the boats when people's lived reality can see that that's not happening.
Yeah, I think that's a major issue. I mean, the government got round various courts labelling Rwanda as not being a safe country by simply passing a law that says Rwanda is safe, or trying to. And I think you're seeing a similar thing is if we just say that the NHS waiting lists are coming down and that the economy is doing great, then, we'll have said it and, we'll have met our promises. The waiting list thing is really worrying. It's people who have ongoing care needs, people who have, for various reasons, dropped off the NHS waiting list. I heard this absolutely devastating story from one of the Labour volunteers who was canvassing in Wellingborough of someone whose elderly father had been on a waiting list for a knee replacement, and then something had happened and he had dropped off the waiting list. They couldn't explain what, and they called up the hospital after he'd been waiting for 6 months to say, could we just find out where is he on the list? And he wasn't on it, and there was absolutely no accountability. So he would not have shown up in those statistics. And I think there's a sort of general consensus that whatever image politicians have of how much pressure the NHS is under at the moment, for anyone who is trying to access treatment, it's a lot worse. Sort of turning up to A&E, it's a lot worse than even that it's reflected in news reports. But Sunak is just very bad at this, and it's not just NHS waiting lists. Last week was Housing Week, and the Conservatives have belatedly caught up with the fact that there's a housing crisis, and young people, i.e. people under 60, aren't voting for them because genuinely is, that is the age now, and not voting for them because of houses. And Sunak wrote an op-ed, and his line was, our plan is working. Like, no, the whole point of doing this intervention is that it's not working. That's why your intervention is needed. If you just try and sort of put forward that message, all anyone hears is, and I'm not going to do an impression of Keir Starmer, but he just doesn't get it, which is the line that Keir Starmer is using a lot. So yes, it is a real danger. It's
his new 5 pledges, isn't it? Our plan is working. Someone eventually is going to go, can you stop saying that? Because it clearly isn't.
Yeah.
Apparently, one of the things that comes up a lot in focus groups about Rishi Sunak when people talk about him is that he's arrogant and he talks down to them. And I think that is...
And patronising.
Patronising. If he keeps saying, our plan is working, and people are like, no, it's not, that's what's going to come up. And people are picking up on that.
I mean, they're going to show him with votes as they keep showing him.
Well, when he goes to A&E, as I had to with my wife a little while ago, goes, the problem is not a lack of staff, the problem is too many patients. And I know that's sort of slightly counterintuitive, but actually, we were put there because we couldn't go to the regular doctor. And so everyone's going to A&E just to kind of get their... We were sent to one bit and then they sent us back. Everyone's going to A&E. And then you just look at it and go, well, there you go. It's clearly not working.
Next up, time to choose our hero and villain of the week. Who got a BAFTA and who just got DAFTA? Zoe.
My hero of the week is Ofcom. because they are investigating GB News for the Sunak Q&A last week for a possible impartiality breach.
Possible
Impartiality breach. And they say this is because their rules on the broadcasting code require that a significant range of views must be included and given due weight in any kind of news programme. And I don't know if anyone here watched the Rishi Sunak debate, the People's, I don't know what it was called, but basically it's quite clear that it was a very well-selected group of people who watched GB News, who weren't giving Sunak the appropriate scrutiny that he should have. And I think just basically it's about time that GB News probably did get some investigation from Ofcom, because there are so many Conservative politicians working for it. You have to ask how impartial it is when it's producing news.
And also puts a camera on a politician's face instead of just following them back around like
to be fair, Rishi did get attacked by COVID Begbie. Did you see that?
Yes, I saw
furious
that.
Scottish man. That was really actually genuinely quite terrifying.
Yeah. I thought he was going to lamp him or something.
Yeah, it went on for 2 minutes. This guy.
Look in my eyes, Rishi Sunak.
And then my villain is the police. Because there was a story today about the 3 people who were murdered in Nottingham. They were stabbed last year, and it's yet another horrible police story about police officers sending inappropriate messages detailing the extent of their injuries to one police officer's wife, sending it to other members of the force. So now this has come out in a court of law, basically, and they're being investigated. So this was the stabbing of Grace O'Malley Kumar and Barnaby Webber. And it just shows you again that the police just often aren't professional in these circumstances, and that clearly there is a level of dehumanization that sometimes goes on, especially when you get these kind of horrible, horrific crimes. And I'm just sick of hearing these stories about the police acting unprofessionally.
Yeah. Rachel.
My hero of the week is John Elledge, because I think he deserves it. And also because he has, in addition to writing a column for The New Statesman and being a regular panellist on this podcast and others, started a new column called NIMBY Watch, where he is taking aim at the small but very vocal groups of people, sort of the minority view that block any housing project anywhere, ever, for any kind of reason. And we keep hearing, can't build on the green belt, like build on brownfield first. So he is detailing housing projects that are on brownfield land, disused car parks or dilapidated buildings, often in and around London, that have really good transport links where nothing is being done on this land, and local residents or local campaigners are blocking them because there aren't enough affordable homes. I mean, I would say that anything more than 0 is better than 0, or because it blocks their view, or because that car park was actually of like really deep cultural, historic value. Yes. And my villain is all of the people who think that you shouldn't build 1,000 homes on a dilapidated car park.
The NIMBYs.
The NIMBYs, yeah.
Okay. How about you, Alistair?
Well, as chairman of my local residents association,
that car park was really important.
But I've read John Elledge's book and it's very good. My hero of the week is Judge Arthur Engeron, because he took his time to give the assessment of the Trump. Well, it was the fact that it actually went up by about 100 million when some more information came in, and it was very. I mean, surely the best way to deal with a lot of this is just by sort of simple, unemotional language, which he did. Apart from, there was just one bit which I did love about the whole family. Their complete lack of contrition and remorse borders on the pathological, which I think borders is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because it is just pathological, isn't it? But not quite as bad as the sneakers that Trump has launched this week. I don't know if you've seen the gold sneakers. Mm-hmm. What I particularly liked, I read an article saying that because they've got red soles, Christian Louboutin could sue for copyright infringement. And I thought that would be, the idea of Al Capone getting done for tax evasion. I quite like the idea of Donald Trump getting done for shoe evasion. I think that could work quite well. But Arthur Engeron's judgment in the Trump case was great.
And villain?
Villain, a very obvious one, is Putin and the horrors of Navalny. I mean, I had a very odd experience when I was on a train or something when I read about Prigozhin dying. And I actually laughed, which is not your usual response, but it was so kind of like, well, of course, don't get on a plane after you've just led a coup against Vladimir Putin. And he was not a particularly nice man. So it was kind of like, well, there you go. Very much a different response to Navalny, and it just and the sight of seeing Putin. There's nothing worse than seeing a charisma vacuum looking pleased with himself, and that is what he's doing at the moment. And it just shows quite how appalling the situation is.
Tucker Carlson show,
and how we desperately need to deal with it a little more seriously.
Right. Okay. So I can't do Ofcom until they've actually issued a decision.
That's okay.
Because they're investigating loads of stuff. And until they actually, do something about it, I ain't giving it to them. And I don't think I can do the police just in total, because it feels to me like there are a lot of people in the police.
But the institution of the
I know,
police.
I get it.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. I can't
get
win
it.
every week.
I can't, yeah. And I'm not going to give it to Putin because it feels like Putin would be the villain every single week.
Yeah.
No, fair enough.
Like if we go that big, do you know what I mean? Obviously, Putin is the villain. But Judge Engerin, I think, has a legitimate claim to Hero of the Week. And I think NIMBYS have a legitimate claim
Down with
to
the NIMBYs.
villains, because there just is a constituency, a demographic in this country that is just no to everything. And the one fucking thing they should have said no to, Brexit, they said yes. So yes, down with the NIMBYs.
Worse than Putin.
Well, now you put it like that.
Fair point. Fair. Next up, we left the EU over 4 years ago. Despite telling us Ramonas not to talk Britain down, the right-wing intelligentsia is doing exactly that. And with such hyperbole that the headlines have become a running joke on social media. Take the Telegraph's own Nostradamus, Alistair Heath, for example. Feel free to laugh on microphone. A huge fan of Brexit, and yet last week he wrote an article headlined, "For the first time in my life, I am now beginning to think Britain is finished." He's not the only one. There are a lot of others just like him. Why are they obsessed with feeding their readers this constant diet of unrelenting lugubriosity? Is it just something to write about, a reflection of their crisis of faith, or is there some darker motive? Alistair, Heath's piece is the latest in a series.
Oh, it is.
That includes cheery gems like Western civilization is being destroyed from within by forces we can't control. And the idiot West is sleeping while the end of the world draws near. And the woke blob is about to achieve its greatest triumph, the final takeover of Britain.
Those guys.
Well, what do you think?
Oh, that woke blob with
Seriously,
their tofu.
though, what is
I think
going
it's
on
insanity.
there?
I think he is.
Happening?
I think Alistair George Freund Heath. He spells Alistair Allister. Speaking as an Alistair, that's enough of a crime in itself.
Well, he was born in France.
He was born in France, and his entire journalistic career seems to be an act of revenge against that fact. My last show was basically...
It's actually Alistair.
Alistair, yeah. It was actually, my last show was slightly inspired by my mother giving me a subscription to the Telegraph. But now I think balance is incredibly important. But then I started reading...
You ain't going to get it in the Telegraph.
No, but literally the day after Liz Truss's budget, I don't think it's controversial to say it was not a roaring success, that budget. And he literally the next day, "This is the best budget I have ever seen, a Tory Prime Minister." And literally a week later, he wrote another one called "I may be wrong, but I'm not wrong." And then
my point stands.
Exactly. And then he had another one sort of like over the summer last year saying that Britain is ruled by a shadowy cabal who refuse to listen to the opinions of the majority. And I was like, yes, the Conservative Party. But no, he's unhinged. And that one is genuinely, Britain I know is no longer here. And it's that sort of, I come into London and I'm scared I'm going to be killed by jihad. And you're not. Okay, it's just, I come into London and I go, this place is falling apart. There's a wonderful old quote. Someone said, you don't notice that the town hall hasn't been painted until it's not painted. And that is what is happening to the fabric of our society all around. We talked about tax cuts. I don't want a tax cut. I want a GP's appointment when I can get one. I want a train that might turn up on time. Most of us don't give a fuck about tax cuts. Most of us care about things working. And that's where Britain's falling apart. Where Alistair Heath screaming about it, and then, as almost all of these ones do, veering into a discussion of Israel and Gaza, is I just think
what's extraordinary is that the editor usually picks like the most clickbaity quote for the title, and you think maybe the piece is not so bad. And with Heath's pieces, they really are. Like the whole thing is like that. It's like a fever dream. Someone once described the paywall in the Telegraph as just walking away from a drunk man in a as it fades. You might expect a generic sort of controversial columnist to pump out this stuff occasionally, but what does it say that he's a Sunday Telegraph editor? Because that to me seems quite an important piece of this puzzle. He's not employed as some Katie Hopkins figure.
No, but at the same time, the Telegraph is a paper I grew up reading because my parents get the Telegraph, and I now read it. And I mean, bless their hearts. I mean, there was one, I read a headline out to my mother, and it says here, the woke rebellion must be fought. I mean, it's bollocks, isn't it? And my mother went, well, actually, I think the woke rebellion must be fought. And I said, well, what is the woke rebellion? And she said, I don't know, but it definitely needs fighting. And that seems to me to be the kind of, it's so, I mean, they've got a woke word count. Everything, the fact that that's the editorial slant makes me look at what was once, whatever your politics, a great newspaper. And it's now a kind of, essentially, sort of like tin hat conspiracy theory, mad propaganda rag.
Rachel, who is your current favourite screaming headline alarmist?
I mean, you gave us a reading list and you didn't put Brendan O'Neill on the reading list, which I can only assume was because you care about our mental health and well-being.
No, but also I don't consider him a journalist of any kind.
No, Brendan O'Neill is somebody who I feel long before ChatGPT was a thing, just wrote all his articles by algorithm. The woke, spin the wheel, school children are now into spin it again, French chocolates, does that work? But of the ones on the reading list, I did like Sherelle Jacobs' one, which is headlined, Britain is almost bankrupt, PM Starmer will be the final nail in the nation's coffin, because what she argues, and I think this is brilliant, is that Labour, you can't trust them on anything, you can't trust them on the economy, they'll just spend loads. Look at the 28 billion green investment plan, which they then scrapped, and that is bad because it shows Labour doesn't have ideas for growth. And even though that was the wrong idea for growth, it's a wonderful sort of, I went through it being like, U-turn of the article and U-turn and U-turn. I can't work out what it's actually arguing. But there are a lot. And I think there are sort of slightly different things going on with what they're trying to do. I am deeply uncomfortable as a British Jew of how, since October 7th, anti-Semitism and the really disturbing rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic incidents, which I have experienced, is being co-opted by a faction of people who I don't really think have ever thought much about anti-Semitism before and don't really seem to care that much about Jews, but by God do they hate Muslims and immigrants, and using British Jews as a kind of shield, and the fact that Alistair Heath's article and so many others sort of, they start off being about what's wrong with Britain, and the answer inevitably is immigration and Islam, and we have to take a real stand about that because of the Jews. That makes me incredibly uncomfortable.
Zoe, is there a danger that for people out there who are isolated or in small communities, it sort of paints a terrifying view of the world that they then fully believe?
I think so, but I don't think it's necessarily those people who are reading the Telegraph. I mean, I think there's so many people. It's a big paper. It has, the thing we should be more worried about are the people who are fully embedded and surrounded by people who are believing this stuff and reading it and parroting it out. I mean, I think people who are isolated and lonely, they tend to get, a lot of them can get their news elsewhere. YouTube, you know, there's so much unfiltered news in inverted commas on there that people are just watching, and there's no sources to it, and it's just totally kind of insane. And then you know, things being shared on WhatsApp and all that. I mean, that's the real kind of conspiratorial end of it. And I think I don't know what we do about that.
But what I'm saying is there's still a kind of glow from its former halo.
Exactly.
Kind of legitimizes it, because if you look at, you know, Anders Breivik manifesto, he wasn't quoting nutty blogs and YouTube videos. You know, he was choosing national newspapers that have some clout and a sort of appearance of respectability to support his arguments.
And I also think that because there seems to be so much interest, there's this monetization now of YouTube and these kind of really, you know, big, insane, polarizing voices on there, that newspapers is trying to find their, you know, their little niche. And the more kind of extreme and outrageous and you know, wild your op-eds are, the more people are going to click them, sign up, read them, get through the paywall. And I do think there is a push for people to start spouting those more extreme views that previously might have been on YouTube. You know.
I thought Rachel's the reading list that we were given, I sort of read most of them, and there was the one thing that struck me about them is basically they were all screaming, "We used to be tolerant, now you bastards have stopped being tolerant." And it struck me as slightly intolerant in the way that they were writing it.
In that list,
They're a bit snowflakey, aren't they?
I know. I mean,
they're very
really
snowflakey,
very easily offended.
They are constantly victims. I think they're defined by their victimhood, despite sort of having gotten Brexit, despite, you know, having the government they wanted for a decade and a half. They're somehow still being
it's time for a conservative
oppressed,
government,
you know, by you know
the woke blob,
a clerk in the National Trust that wore a rainbow
and they got
pin
triggered
or something. But do you think there is a divide in that list between people like, let's say, Douglas Murray, whom one might suspect of a grift, and people like Alison Pearson, whom one might suspect actually believes every word that she writes? And who's more dangerous?
I don't know. I mean, there's a slight element with almost all of them, that there is a slight, you know, even a stop clock tells the right time twice a day. I mean, I think the bottom line is that we live in this furiously binary world where there's black and white, and we all know every issue is not black and white. There is nuance, but nuance doesn't sell papers. The entire bedrock of journalism, which was essentially buying newspapers, has disappeared. And as you said so rightly, you know, if you can get clicks, then you might still have a job in the morning. And that is why people are chasing, whether it's a comedian putting his clip up on YouTube or if it's a journalist putting an article out on the website, you are chasing engagement. And that seems to me it's a little unfair to say you believe it and you don't. But I think, again, there's a massive grey area between the two.
Rachel, is there a political long game here, do you think? Is there a coordinated attempt to shift the debate further to the right? You know, the whole movement around, you know, anti-Semitism at the moment, it does seem to be a coordinated thing to attack a particular community that they don't like. Is there a general kind of movement to just drive everyone?
I think there's some of that. And I think the way the media ecosystem works, in that if an issue or a post goes viral, then it will be talked about on mainstream news channels, and the BBC will feel the need to have a discussion about it. And that's kind of how you change the way discourse is happening. But I actually think there's something else that's going on too that's really interesting. On the reading list, there is Stephen Glover, who writes about how, I'm going to quote this, it sometimes feels as though Labour didn't really lose in 2010 and the Conservatives haven't properly been in power. Next year Labour will probably win the election and resume formal control as if they haven't ever
so the last
been away.
14 years
That was actually Labour.
Bobby Ewing pre-shower.
I'm hearing this a lot. I went to the Popcomms launch. I listened to all the speeches, not just Liz Truss's. And that was very much the message that, yes, the Conservatives have been in government, but they haven't really been in power because Tony Blair made all these changes in the new Labour era and changed institutions and devolution and put his left-wing friends at the BBC and all these cultural institutions and signed us up to all these international institutions. And basically, the institutions are woke, and therefore, what could a Conservative government hope to achieve? And the reason I think that's really interesting is because the Conservatives are having to grapple. I've had senior Conservative figures text me this privately and say, between us, the real question is, we had 14 years in power. Why do we have so little to show for it?
Yeah.
Why didn't we achieve any of these Conservative policies that we said we would? So there's this narrative that it's because the structure of how government and society is run is inherently woke and left-wing, and that's the excuse. That's why we failed to do what we said we were going to do. So I think you're going to hear a lot more about that after an election defeat. But I also think it's really worrying because it just takes away any kind of accountability. You're basically saying life's really shit now. And when you go, yeah, but you guys have been in power, they go, well, we haven't. Not really. It wasn't us.
They should get together with the Corbynistas who are convinced that he won the 2017 election.
They won the
They'd be great friends.
Zoe, one final question. The equivalent for the left seems to me to be confined to quite niche spaces. Do you agree with that? Or is it just my impression? Are there mainstream left-wing publications that do the equivalent sort of? What explains that?
It's interesting. I mean, I think clearly there is more power and more money in a lot of these right-leaning newspapers than there are in these left-leaning ones, and that's probably for quite obvious sort of ideological reasons about building a business and who has power and things like that. But I mean, I think you are seeing more of is a mobilization of very left-wing voices on social media, and these kind of communities growing. But you're right, they don't have the same sort of mainstream media power that the right do. I mean, I can only presume that's because of the reasons I just said, because, there's more money behind that. That's kind of the way that the political system has lent. And, the Telegraph has always been very cosy with the Conservative government. And, that's that. I mean, obviously, things have tended to be always been based in the centre, but most of those big papers have shifted slightly more towards the right over the past few years. But yeah, it feels like the left mobilises more on social media in these sort of circles, I guess that maybe is to do with it being more grassroots, more kind of
maybe slightly younger.
Slightly
Problem
younger.
is the dictatorship of the proletariat has failed to grab the means of production. That's obviously what's happened.
Okay.
What do you call what we're doing right now?
We've reached the end of the show, so it's time for escape routes. What cultural caves have we been spelunking this week? Rachel.
I always go lowbrow and everyone else goes highbrow. So I'm going to do a mixture of both today. I have read and I interviewed him on it, Brian Clough's new book, Fluke. I believe he's been on this podcast to talk about it. It's political philosophy mixed with evolutionary biology and some physics and some theology in there. It's basically about the chance randomness of life and how very, very small things can make big differences. And it's totally changed the way I think about things. But one of the things that it sparked me to go do is go and rewatch the 1998 film Sliding Doors, Gwyneth Paltrow, where she misses the train by a split second and her lives diverge, which one is a great film, two reads like it was a philosophy PhD student's fever dream, and three, like Brian Clough's book, has got me thinking small things like, oh, it doesn't matter that I've missed this bus or whatever, because my life could go in a completely different direction now, and that could be really positive. And also it could be disastrous, but we're talking about positive things here. It does change your way of thinking when you give up the sense that you can control and predict what's going to happen and just accept happenstance and randomness in life.
As counterweight, I would offer a very good episode of Frasier called Sliding Frasiers, which takes that plot and diverges wildly on a very small decision and ends up in exactly the same place after taking a completely different journey. How about you?
That's convergence.
Right, that is convergence.
That's the idea of convergence.
How about you, Zoe?
I have been watching The Apprentice.
Okay.
Which it's just
glutton for
such
punishment.
Brilliant TV. I'm sorry to say, I always very much enjoy it.
I can't stand it.
Yeah, that's totally fine. I mean, the thing that's
it.
ridiculous about it is these people are what business people, that's the whole shtick. But every week they make them do something that you just wouldn't do. Like they had to make cheesecakes, and it was all about how good the cheesecakes were, or they have to sell,
Are you sure you weren't watching Bake Off?
Actually, come to think of it, Paul Hollywood was there. Yeah, it was. But it's just so extraordinary what these people put themselves through to just be berated by Alan Sugar for, TV. But and I don't think it used to be that actually you got quite good people on The Apprentice, and now it has become a bit ridiculous, and they deliberately clearly get people who are just provocateurs. But
I would watch it but for Alan Sugar, but just that toxic cock-swinging boss thing celebrating, you're fired. I cannot think of a worse thing to end a program on, but literally celebrating the notion of someone.
I do know what you mean, but the people are often so ridiculous that you want to be there telling them they're fired.
But it's that thing, if they go I'm a hard guy and he's made a terrible mistake and doesn't understand the kind of guy he has let go, and you go, you're making fucking cheesecake, mate. It's not, you're not.
And you put a whole fig on top.
What's your escape route,
I'm terribly sorry to be mentioning another podcast on my debut appearance, but I have been listening to a lot of The Rest is History because I do a lot of miles, and it's just it's got that wonderful, I'm fascinated by history anyway, and I love hearing anything about it, but it's got that wonderful mixture of lightness, and there's a real charm and chemistry between Dominic Sandbrook and Tom Holland, who present it, and they do deep dives where necessary. Huge hole in my knowledge of the Aztecs, and they did a 7-part thing on it, and I now sort of feel I can discuss the Aztecs with anyone. But when you're on long drives, really entertaining history, like anyone who does anything with love, and you can hear how much they're enthuses you. And it's I've got another 400 episodes to go, and I'm thoroughly enjoying all of them.
Okay, well, I'm sure they need the help.
It's not my favourite podcast, obviously.
I watched 2 very good films, highbrow and lowbrow, like Rachel. And the first one is The Holdovers, which is just the loveliest, most life-affirming thing I've seen in a long time. And Thanksgiving is the goriest, funniest horror I've seen in a very, very long time.
I can't do horror.
I'm not good with horror.
It's literally people murdering each other because of Black Friday sales, and I cannot tell you how funny and dark it is. And those are my recommendations, and that's the end of the Tuesday edition of Oh God What Now. Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
And thank you to this week's guest, Alistair Barrie.
Thank you for having me.
Alistair, where are you performing this year, and where can people get tickets?
I've just finished a tour, but actually probably the thing to plug is I had to pull one of the tour dates. The tour's called Woke in Progress, so that seems to fit in with some of the stuff we were talking about. I am in Liverpool on the 1st of March with the rescheduled date that I had to pull last year. And so generally speaking, just follow me on the socials to find out where I am. But if you're in Liverpool on the 1st of March, I will be doing the solo show there.
Lovely. And Oh God What Now? We'll be back on Thursday for our backers and Friday morning for everyone else. We have had a surge of supporters over the past couple of weeks, which is very encouraging. Times are getting tougher in podcasts as well as the outside world. So when you pledge a tiny amount to us, it really makes a difference, and we are really grateful. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.